It was supposed to be a serene escape from the chaos of city life, a night hike under a full moon to clear my head. I had always sought solace in nature, and a new trail promised solitude and breathtaking views. Little did I know, this hike would transform into a harrowing ordeal that would haunt me for years. The day had been unusually warm for autumn, with the setting sun casting a golden glow over the landscape. I drove to the trailhead, the car's engine humming softly as I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of a cricket and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. I glanced around and saw no other cars, a sign of perfect solitude. The trailhead was marked by an old wooden sign, partially obscured by creeping vines. The inscription was barely visible in the fading light. I set off with a feeling of quiet anticipation, the moon now casting an eerie silver glow over the path. The trail was narrow and winding, flanked by dense trees whose branches intertwined to form a dark, oppressive canopy. The shadows seemed to dance on the ground, creating unsettling patterns that made me feel like I was being watched. The initial part of the hike was peaceful. The crisp night air was invigorating, and the silence of the forest was a welcome change from the constant hum of city life. Every now and then, the soft rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl broke the silence. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, spidery shadows that flickered and shifted with every step I took. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I began to notice that the path was becoming less defined. The trail markers were few and far between, and the terrain grew increasingly uneven. I found myself navigating through thick underbrush and overgrown vegetation. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow more distant, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. After about an hour of hiking, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. It was an unexpected sight in the middle of the dark woods. The cabin looked as though it had been abandoned for decades, with its sagging roof and boarded-up windows. Despite a nagging sense of unease, curiosity got the better of me. I approached the cabin, hoping to explore. The door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the stillness of the night. Inside, the cabin was a time-worn relic of neglect. Dust covered everything, and the musty smell was nearly overpowering. The furniture, now reduced to rotting wooden frames, stood as ghostly remnants of a bygone era. A large, stained mattress lay in one corner, and on a rusty table, I noticed a journal. It was partially open, the pages yellowed and brittle. I hesitated before reading, but felt an inexplicable pull toward the journal. The entries were disturbing, detailing a series of unsettling experiences. The writer spoke of being pursued, hearing footsteps in the dark, and a growing sense of paranoia. They watch me from the shadows, one entry read. Every time I close my eyes, I hear them breathing. My heart raced as I read those words. The sense of dread that had been simmering beneath the surface now surged to the forefront. I quickly closed the journal, my mind racing. It was time to leave, but as I stepped outside, I noticed a profound change in the atmosphere. The forest had become unnervingly silent. The usual nocturnal sounds had vanished, leaving an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. I resumed my hike, determined to put the cabin behind me. However, the trail had taken on a disorienting quality. The path twisted and turned in unnatural ways, and the landmarks I had noted earlier were no longer visible. My map, which had been accurate up to this point, now seemed useless. The forest was closing in around me, and I felt a growing sense of being lost. As the hours passed, the moonlight grew dimmer, obscured by drifting clouds. The temperature dropped, and the forest grew even more foreboding. I came to the edge of a cliff overlooking a deep ravine. The view was stark and bleak, the darkness stretching endlessly below. My flashlight flickered erratically, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. In the dim light, I noticed a set of fresh footprints in the mud, leading to the edge of the cliff and stopping abruptly. My pulse quickened as I imagined someone standing there, gazing into the abyss. The realization that these footprints had been made recently filled me with a chilling sense of dread. I turned away quickly, desperate to leave this place behind. The trail back seemed to have changed. The trees appeared to loom closer, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. Every rustle, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. My flashlight flickered again and then went out completely, plunging me into utter darkness. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of my own panicked breaths and the pounding of my heart. In the pitch black, I stumbled through the underbrush, my clothes tearing on branches and my skin scraping on thorny brambles. I felt an unsettling presence close behind me, as though something or someone was trailing me through the darkness. I could hear a faint, rhythmic sound that resembled heavy breathing, growing louder with each step I took. Desperation set in as I crashed through the underbrush, my fear overriding any sense of direction. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees forming a menacing barrier. I ran blindly, my thoughts a chaotic blur. My flashlight was dead, leaving me with only the eerie sounds of the forest and the sensation of being pursued. I stumbled upon an old wooden fence in a small clearing. The fence was weathered and rotting, its wood splintered and twisted. It was a surreal sight in the midst of the darkness. With trembling hands, I scrambled over the fence, my shoes slipping on the decaying wood. I glanced back one last time and saw the forest still and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, lurking just out of sight. As I emerged onto a road, utterly exhausted and trembling, I felt a surge of relief. The road was a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the forest. I looked back at the forest one last time, the trees now appearing as dark, menacing sentinels. I had escaped, but the memory of the haunting footprints at the cliff's edge and the chilling sensation of being watched would stay with me forever. Over the next few days, I tried to put the experience behind me, but the nightmares persisted. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that dark forest, running from an unseen presence. The cabin and its eerie journal haunted my thoughts, and I found myself questioning what I had experienced. Was it just a figment of my imagination, or had I truly encountered something malevolent? Eventually, I sought help from a local historian who specialized in the area's folklore. To my dismay, they confirmed that the cabin had a dark history. It had once been owned by a hermit who vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind cryptic writings and disturbing rumors of being hunted. The historian's words only deepened the sense of unease I felt. The forest held its secrets tightly, and I vowed never to return. I had learned the hard way that some trails are better left unexplored, their darkness concealing horrors that should never be faced alone. The trail may have ended, but the nightmare of that night would forever haunt my memories, a grim reminder of the dangers that lurk in the unseen corners of the world. The unsettling silence, the haunting footprints, and the oppressive presence of the forest were etched into my mind, a permanent scar from a night I could never forget. From the moment I laced up my hiking boots, an unsettling feeling gripped me. I had planned a solo hike in the remote mountains, seeking a break from the chaos of city life. The weather, however, seemed to conspire against me. Overcast skies and thick fog clung to the trees, casting an eerie pall over the landscape. Despite my instincts telling me to reconsider, I pressed on, determined to reach the peace of nature. The first stretch of the trail was straightforward and soothing. The path was well marked, and my footsteps created a comforting rhythm. The distant calls of birds added to the serenity, and I let myself relax, absorbing the tranquility. Yet, as the fog thickened, the comforting sounds of the forest began to fade. The chirps of birds became sporadic and then stopped altogether. The forest grew unnervingly quiet, and the air felt heavy. As I continued, the trail, once clear and familiar, began to twist and turn in ways that seemed increasingly unfamiliar. The map I had with me was now of little use, its details obscured by the thickening fog. My compass spun erratically, unable to provide a reliable direction. Anxiety began to gnaw at me as the forest grew darker and more oppressive. The trees, once spaced generously apart, now seemed to crowd closer together, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The temperature dropped abruptly, and my breath formed white puffs that mingled with the swirling fog. My sense of direction was becoming increasingly unreliable. The familiar trail now felt like it was shifting, as though the forest itself were conspiring to keep me lost. Panic began to set in. I tried to remember the landmarks I had passed, but the fog distorted everything, making the path ahead appear as a shadowy maze. Just as my anxiety reached its peak, I stumbled into a small clearing. It seemed to appear out of nowhere, an unsettling respite from the dense forest. In the center stood an old wooden table, covered in a thick layer of moss. The table was adorned with strange symbols carved into its surface. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift as I looked at them, their shapes constantly changing. Surrounding the symbols were odd trinkets, animal bones, dried herbs, and a crude doll with twisted limbs and unsettling lifelike eyes. My skin crawled with discomfort, and an overwhelming sense of being watched settled over me. I turned to leave the clearing, but a sudden gust of wind roared through the trees. The fog swirled and the shadows danced ominously. Out of the thickening mist emerged a figure, an old woman dressed in tattered, dark robes. Her face was hidden beneath a hood, but her presence alone sent a jolt of fear through me. Her slow, deliberate movements and the intensity of her gaze were deeply unsettling. My legs felt rooted to the spot as I watched her approach. Despite my desperate desire to flee, I found myself drawn toward the table. The symbols on it seemed to writhe and change, their forms constantly shifting. The doll's eyes seemed to follow me with an unnerving intensity. The air around me grew heavy and suffocating, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Panic surged through me. It was clear that this was no ordinary encounter. The forest, which had once seemed so familiar, now felt like it was closing in on me, warping reality itself. My mind raced with the grim realization that I needed to escape. I turned and fled through the fog, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. The path, once clear, was now a confusing labyrinth of twisted branches and tangled roots. Each step felt like a battle as the underbrush clawed at my clothes and the roots wrapped around my feet. I stumbled and fell multiple times, my hands and knees scraped raw from the rough ground. The fog was so dense that visibility was reduced to mere feet, and every sound seemed amplified and menacing. Adrenaline surged through me, driving me forward despite the pain in my limbs. I struggled to keep moving, pushing through the dense underbrush as the fog swirled around me. My sense of direction was completely distorted, and I felt utterly lost. The oppressive quiet of the forest was broken only by my labored breathing and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. Exhausted and frightened, I finally broke through the fog into a part of the trail that seemed oddly familiar. The sun's emerging light offered a stark contrast to the darkness, and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. When I reached my car, relief washed over me. The forest now seemed deceptively peaceful, its menacing shadows reduced to mere shapes. Yet, the memory of the woman, the eerie symbols, and the unsettling doll haunted me. A constant reminder of the darkness hidden behind nature's facade. The experience had profoundly changed me, revealing that some places and encounters are better left unexplored. The wilderness, despite its beauty, can harbor secrets and dangers beyond imagination. I've always loved hiking. The solitude and tranquility of nature have always calmed my mind. That's why, on a chilly autumn evening, I set out on a trail I hadn't explored before. It was a remote path that wound through dense woods and ended at a secluded overlook. The map I had showed no cabins or amenities, just miles of untouched forest. The first few hours were serene. The leaves crunched softly underfoot, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of fallen foliage. I felt a deep connection to the wilderness, a reminder of how small I was in the grand scheme of things. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I wasn't worried. I had my flashlight, a compass, and plenty of supplies. The light began to fade faster than I anticipated. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest seemed to grow darker. I reached into my backpack and retrieved a small headlamp. Its beam cut through the growing gloom, casting long shadows on the trees. I decided to press on, eager to reach the overlook before full nightfall. An hour later, I realized that the path was becoming increasingly difficult to follow. The trail was overgrown with tangled vines and thorny bushes. My heart raced as I pushed through the underbrush. The comforting sounds of the forest had vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional snap of a twig. Just as I was starting to doubt my decision, I came upon a small clearing. It was an odd, open space surrounded by thick trees, and in the center stood an old scarecrow. It was an unusual sight. Most scarecrows are simple figures meant to ward off birds, but this one was different. It was meticulously dressed in tattered clothes, its straw-stuffed body standing stiffly in the fading light. Its face was a burlap sack with a crudely stitched-on smile and button eyes. A long, twisted branch served as its right arm, and its left arm hung limply at its side. The scarecrow seemed oddly out of place, but I didn't think much of it initially. I took a few photos, admiring the eerie detail. There was something unsettling about the figure, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Perhaps it was the way the eyes seemed to follow me, or the unnervingly realistic smile. I shivered despite myself. As twilight deepened, the temperature dropped noticeably. I began to feel a sense of urgency. The once familiar path was now shrouded in darkness, and the dense forest around me seemed to close in. I had been following a trail that now felt increasingly foreign. My compass spun erratically, and the forest seemed to shift around me. I noticed a faint light through the trees and made my way toward it, hoping it would lead me back to safety. The light grew brighter as I approached, but when I finally emerged into another clearing, I was horrified to see a disturbing scene. There, in the middle of the clearing, were several scarecrows, each one more grotesque than the last. They were arranged in a circle, their hollow eyes and twisted grins creating a nightmarish tableau. Each scarecrow was different. Some had their faces painted with disturbing expressions. Others were adorned with bits of animal bones and scraps of fabric. They were meticulously crafted, but with an unsettling twist. The entire scene felt like a macabre installation, a cruel joke played by the forest itself. One scarecrow stood out among the rest. Its face was a mask of sorrow, with eyes that seemed to glisten in the dimming light. As I drew closer, I noticed something strange about the base of its stand, an old, weathered sign reading, "For the Lost." A chill ran down my spine. I turned to leave, but the forest seemed to have changed. The trees were closer now, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and a heavy silence had fallen. I could hear faint whispers, almost like a distant conversation, but the words were indecipherable. Panic set in as I tried to navigate back. The underbrush seemed to close in around me, and every direction looked the same. My flashlight flickered, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The forest felt alive, as if it were conspiring to keep me trapped. I stumbled through the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness was almost absolute, and the forest seemed to be closing in on me. The whispers turned into screams, echoing through the trees. The sound was disorienting, making it difficult to determine where I was or where I was going. My sense of direction was completely lost. In my frantic search for a way out, I came across a small, dilapidated shack. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it seemed like a potential refuge. I approached cautiously, the door creaking ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The only furniture was a rickety wooden chair and a small table covered in dust. I knew I had to leave immediately. I turned to exit the shack, but as I stepped outside, I saw the more scarecrows moving toward me. Their limbs creaked and groaned as they walked, their hollow eyes fixed on me with a malevolent intent. Their twisted grins seemed to widen, and I could feel their gaze following me with every step. I ran, tearing through the forest with a renewed sense of urgency. The forest seemed to close in on me, the shadows lengthening and the darkness deepening. The whispers grew into a cacophony of screams, echoing through the trees. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming. My legs felt like lead, but I pushed on, driven by sheer fear. After what felt like hours, I finally emerged onto a familiar trail. The moonlight bathed the path in a pale glow, and I saw the sign marking the trailhead. I stumbled out of the woods, exhausted and terrified, vowing never to return. The sense of relief was overwhelming as I reached my car and drove away from that nightmarish forest. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. The scarecrows are etched into my memory, their grotesque faces haunting my dreams. The whispers and the eerie, unsettling silence of the forest have left an indelible mark on my psyche. And though I've tried to forget, I can still hear those whispers in the dark, a reminder of the evening I ventured too far off the path and encountered something far more sinister than I could ever have imagined.